Today's guest is a podcast host who's getting 4 to 5 million downloads per month on their show. Their podcast is called All Ears English. It's an ESL podcast, so English as a second language. Her name is Linsday McMahon, and I brought her on the show to talk about how her podcast has achieved such monumental success. I mean, really, it's a massive show. It ranked number 1 in Apple Podcasts for education-based podcasts and also ranked number 9 in global business podcasts. Another really cool thing is that they were actually in Lufthansa's in-flight entertainment for people who are flying with that airline. So you could actually listen to the podcast as you're on the plane, which I think is really cool. And the podcast has also partnered with a lot of notable brands like Lululemon, Grammarly, etc., etc. It's a huge show, and it means that Linsday is very, very qualified to talk about what it takes to grow a very successful podcast. Welcome back to Oh My Pod, the podcast that teaches you how to automate and grow your podcast so that you can grow your business. I'm your host, Justin J. Moore. In this episode, Linsday and I talked about a few ways that you can grow your podcast, one of which being feed drops, which is putting one of your episodes in the podcast feed of a podcast that's similar to yours to kind of get access to those listeners. Another obviously is podcast guesting, which she says is actually the number 1 way to grow your podcast. And another interesting thing that she said is that she believes social media is not a good way to grow a podcast. And she kind of breaks that down and why she believes that in this episode. Just before we get into this episode, I want to say that if you're listening to this, you probably want to grow your podcast, and you also probably have a business that you would like to grow with the podcast, vice versa. And for all of that, I have created a community on the platform called School. It's totally free. There's tons of resources in there that should be paid resources, but they're all free for you so that I can help you as much as possible on this journey. The link for that will be right at the top of the show notes. I hope to see you in there. Okay, let's get into the episode. Okay, Linsday, welcome to Oh My Pod. I'm super excited for this.
Hi, Justin. I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me on.
I think that you might be the biggest podcast or podcaster that I've ever had up until this point.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Honored.
It's super, this is one of the reasons I started this show actually, was because I think for anybody who's listening to this, the most important thing is to hear from people who have already done it. And I also believe that there's individual things that may work for one person and might not work for someone else, or might not feel aligned or authentic. But I think some of the things that you're bringing to the table today they're things that I'm personally really interested in. And I know that when you're going to talk about them, it's from personal experience. So I think that's the strongest testimonial, right? That you're actually doing it or have done it. Yeah. So first of all, just give us a brief overview of what your podcast is and how long you've had it and what kind of success and traction you've seen. Yeah, just go riff on that.
Okay, sounds good. So glad to be here again. Thank you, Justin. So I started All Ears English podcast back in 2013. So this is already another era, right? 2013, more than 10 years ago. Our show is targeted to global professionals, adults who are learning English as a second language. So
cool.
That target listener is global, is everywhere. We have a heavy listener base in Asia, East Asia, but we have listeners in South America, expats who live in the US and Canada, and then people in Europe. It just took off from the beginning because initially our vision was to actually give listeners a way to enjoy learning English. This group of people in my mind, they've been kind of traumatized with old school ways of learning English, right? The old rote memorization, take a textbook and then know you're wrong, learn the grammar. We wanted to make it fun. It was that simple. And it took off from the beginning. Our branding was strong. Our color has always been yellow, which has always stood out in Apple Podcasts, Spotify.
Cool.
And from there, it just continued to grow. And I felt that we had something special. And so I knew it had to go on. And it's been going on since then. The All Ears English
Podcast. That's crazy. So that's 11 years now.
It's been 11 years. Yeah, it's wild. It's wild.
Oh my gosh.
We haven't even had time to celebrate our 10-year anniversary because we're so busy publishing episodes.
Yeah, amazing.
the show itself does about 4.5 million downloads a month. We did get cut down in terms of download numbers after the Apple iOS 17 update in the fall. However, that update was kind of a blessing for me because
Okay.
I realized that the key metric in podcasting is downloads, but it's really not what matters. What matters
So
is
wait,
unique
just
listeners.
just to go back just briefly, because I think this is like really important, and for us it's like normal because we're in this world. But can you just tell us what happened at that period of time that changed, and then what changed in your numbers?
Yeah, for sure. So with iOS 17 back in late September of 2023, Apple made an update where it changed the way it delivers automatic downloads. So for some devices, for some listeners, if they came back after being paused, after not listening for 2 weeks or so, it would automatically download an entire back catalog. And this is well known and established in our industry, as you said, Justin, but your average listener is kind of, what do you mean? What's automatic downloads? They just made it better for the listener because listeners don't want an entire back catalog to be downloaded. And we have a huge back catalog, of course. And so a lot of the shows that were being heavily affected by the entire industry was downsized by, I don't know, 25, 30% or something, as far as I understand. So most shows were affected by this. But big back catalogs, large shows, international shows, frequent publishing schedules. We publish 4 days, 5 days a week now.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So we
Wow.
went
Okay,
from
I did
being
not know that.
yeah. So we went from being a show that does about 8 million downloads a month to about 4.5 to 5 million.
Oh my
However,
gosh.
I work with some consultants and they have really helped me see that ironically, as my show has dropped in downloads, it's been growing in listeners, which is the amazing part, which
Okay.
is what actually matters. Right. And so there's nothing to worry about here. Right. This is about growing new listeners by using strategies that I think we're going to be talking about today. I think we're starting to see this downward trend across the industry of downloads being right-sized, starting to plateau out and starting to see the end of it. But I see the bright side of that. And I think, okay, I know what grows a show. I'm going to keep growing All Ears English and now our current network into the next 10 years to keep maintaining our place as one of the top language podcasts. So
Yeah, first of all, this is awesome. Language podcasts helped me a ton when I was first met my fiance, and her first language is German and second language is Italian, and I wasn't going to try to learn German because that's like, difficult language to learn, but I listened to so much podcasts in like so many episodes in Italian, like constantly. While I was walking, while I was driving, like I would say upwards of 100 hours, and I was just listening to people having conversations. Like I wouldn't even necessarily listen to podcasts that were trying to teach me the language. I did that as well, but I would just kind of be a fly on the wall in certain, conversations in Italian. So I think podcasting is like, what an incredible way to learn a language. Is like podcasting is something you do when you are, physically busy, but your mind is not active. And so what a better time to subliminally, however you say that, like put the language in your brain. So yeah. And I even can think of a few people who I would recommend to listen to your podcast because they're trying to get better English. People from Italy. So very cool. And yeah, and then also on the downloads thing, it's like you may not have as big of a number to sort of put out there in terms of like vanity metrics, but the actual data, what matters for the podcast, what matters for the business behind the podcast, you now have more accurate data. So like you said, it's probably actually a blessing. So like, I love how you said that. So there's a lot of ways that I think we could go. One thing that's particularly interesting to me is the business that you've built around the podcast and how the podcast has supported that. But I think what would be best for this episode is to just focus on what you said before, the growth things, the things that have worked. And then also what I think would be interesting and what you suggested before we started recording here was the things that maybe didn't work or that you thought would work and didn't, a couple things like that. So I think that we should just get right into it. You sent a few ideas through, before we booked, and I love them. The first thing is feed drops. And I must be as humble as possible here and say that I really don't know what's going on here. So what are feed drops and how have they actually helped grow this huge podcast that you have now?
Yes, 100%. So the basic concept, and this is one of the fastest ways to grow a show. And again, when I say grow a show, I no longer mean downloads, right? I mean actual unique listeners, human beings that are going to hit play every time. They're waiting for your episode. That's what you really want. That's what's going to help your advertisers convert and you sell your courses and do everything you want to do with your business. And so essentially what this is you're taking an episode from your show. Maybe it's probably a brand new episode that you've created just for this drop. And you're putting it on another show that has a similar or identical audience or complementary audience that would benefit from that in a way that you've made a deal, an agreement. Sometimes it's monetary, sometimes it's a swap, right? It could be that between your show and this other fellow podcaster. I mean, it starts with having relationships in the industry, Justin, right? So for our show, one of the first things we did when we first launched is we emailed every current podcaster and said, hey, let's meet, let's get to know each other, let's collaborate. So it has to start with having relationships. So essentially, you're taking your episode, putting it in their feed. It may be that they create a custom intro, that they feature your episode in the middle of a custom intro and outro. That's what we do.
Yeah. Cool.
Or they just drop it in there. I've seen that done on The Daily, the New York Times podcast. So it just depends on the vibe they want me to. I listen to that all the time. That's a huge show, by the way.
It's massive. Yeah.
Yeah. So the point is you're getting exposure to a brand new audience. And I think it's one of the most effective ways to grow a show.
Yeah. The one thing that I'll add to that, because I always love to kind of like summarize what someone says for the audience and in like how I think about it in my brain. Maybe they like that, maybe they don't. But I think that like what the strongest thing that of what you just said there is that you are showing up in front of people who already are listening to podcasts. Whereas something else that we mentioned earlier that I think we'll touch on in a bit more detail is like, you know how hard it is to get somebody onto Spotify from Instagram? Like I know as a musician, like I was getting like millions and millions of views and I can see how many people clicked my links for Spotify. It's like 1,000 people, right? It's so difficult to get people to a podcast from social media. But when you show up in people's feeds, especially of shows that are already doing a lot of the things that you're doing, like for you guys, anything to do with language or language learning or like anything like that, you are literally like, it's exactly where you want to show up from. So feed drops, amazing. I also want to know like logistically, like if somebody was thinking about like, okay, what's the first thing that I would do to actually put this into play? Then what would you say?
Yeah. So logistically, the way this plays out for us is that we actually do this more often within our own network. So we have a network, the All Ears English Network. There are 3 shows. They're all owned by us. They're our properties.
Oh, okay.
One is the big show, All Ears English, and then we have Business English, and we have IELTS Energy. IELTS is an exam that our audience needs to take if they want to immigrate. So it's easier for us.
This is amazing.
Yeah, we do this every month, actually. We do a planned, intentional, we call it a relaunch. It's not really a launch of anything, but it's a promo. We promote one of the shows in the network every month, and then the show being promoted will get its episode on the other, an episode from that show on the other shows. So that's obviously, if you have something like that, whether it's your own self-owned shows or other shows in a network, that's the benefit of kind of being in a network. So looking into being in a network could help in some ways. However, if you're just an indie, which I love that too, by the way, building those relationships, reaching out and starting to prospect, make a list of who do you like in your industry? Who do you feel like you get along with, that you have a similar perspective? Also, it should be similar, right? So if you end up on a show that has a totally different take on your industry and then they come over to you, maybe it's not going to be a great match. The people listening to that show might not be a great match for you. So start to make that list and then start to reach out. I know I had someone in my industry go on vacation recently, and I'm just in a chat group with that person. And they said, what should I do? I don't want to stop publishing. And I suggested, hey, why not reach out to someone else in this group and offer a feed drop swap, right?
That's
so
crazy.
You could get content while you're on vacation. And then when you come back, you could place your content on their feed. Everyone gets new listeners and you have content. Right?
Wow. I get what you're saying about networks. And it's funny because I realized kind of the second time that you said the word network that you were talking about like the actual like official podcast networks. I heard network and I was thinking like just, networking, like network of people. But I totally get what you mean. So there's the difference between people who are podcasting with a network who does all of the back end and all the marketing and everything, and then independently podcasting. So I hear that. So you can, if you were part of a network, obviously you have access to a huge amount of other people who have great shows as well. But if you don't have that, then like you said, just start connecting with people.
Start building relationships. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, totally. And also like content, somebody else's amazing content sharing on your page for your listeners, which allows you then to not have to stress about next week's episode if you were on vacation or something. It's huge. That's such a great idea. So I love that. Now I better understand, like I fully understand what you're talking about with feed drops now. Great idea. The second thing that you said, and what we're doing literally right now, is guest appearances. Now, I have talked to, I'd say I probably have 6 or 7 episodes focused around podcast guesting with a variety of different people. One of them is Alex Sanfilippo, who owns Podmatch, which is literally how we met, which is like a great testimonial for Podmatch. I feel like I'm saying Podmatch in every episode now. How do you approach podcast guesting? What is your strategy, and like what's unique about how you approach doing this?
Yeah, I would like to be more, I should be more intentional when it comes to guesting, because I actually believe it is the number one most effective way. I would even put this ahead of feed drops in terms of ability to grow a show. But we've always done guesting. We go through fits and starts when it comes to guesting, unfortunately. And I've been thinking about getting one of my employees, my team members on this and giving them a metric. We want to be on 8 shows a month, and we need to deliver that metric, right? And so having that as such an important goal, and that just tells you how effective it is. Building the relationships, it's the same process that you would go through if you're looking for a potential feed drop partner, right? What are some other shows that would make sense? And then thinking about what could you add of value, approaching them with a targeted email. Not generic. You're not sending the same email to everyone. For us, we find it more effective if we can come in with a niche skill to a broader show. So for example, one show in our network, one piece of expertise we have in our company is IELTS. Like I said before, the IELTS exam. This is very specific knowledge and expertise that not every ESL teacher has. So I would have more success going over to a broad ESL show and saying, hey, could I have my ex-examiner expert on the show? And then we would talk about the entire network. We talk about All Ears English, IELTS Energy, and Business English. Does that make sense? So more targeted is better for what you offer. Yeah.
This is great. And one thing that I'll add personally, and you can tell me if this kind of resonates with you too and what you guys do, is that when you have your own podcast and you're thinking about who to bring on as a guest, I always say that I look for people who have expertise that outclasses my own in a certain field or a certain part of my niche industry. So for me, it's podcasting. You have expertise in growing a show to millions. You have literally, great example, feed drops. I didn't really know a lot about that. And so for me, it's like a no-brainer. It's like, number one, I get a great guest to educate the audience on something that I can't talk about myself right now. And at the second time, I'm also becoming a more well-versed person in my industry. And number 3, we're also now we know each other, and now we're on, first name basis, and we have this connection, this networking like we just talked about. And so, yeah, guesting is obviously it's bar to none. It's so strong, but it does need to be done in a way where it's very intentional. I'm very against the shows that are 45 minutes of unguided interviews with experts. I'm I don't know, who's going to really want to listen to that. So I think it has to be done in a specific way. And so other than Podmatch, are there other ways that you find shows to go on to?
For sure. Yeah. I mean, so in terms of me going on other shows, it's kind of interesting because you think, okay, your audience, you may have a few English language learners, but probably not a ton. I would guess your show, right, is more native English speakers. So my strategy in going on other shows is eventually, if I have time in the future, starting some sort of coaching business around podcasting and helping people grow their shows. It's not an immediate project. It's sort of on the back burner because my current business is keeping me so busy. But it's just good to have my name out there. When it comes to looking for shows to go on to get direct English language learners, it's more about just networking group, now loosely termed networking groups that I'm in, WhatsApp chat groups I'm in my industry. My industry is relatively tight knit. People kind of know each other. They know names, they know each other, they collaborate. So things like that. And then in terms of I like to get experts on my show, which I wouldn't necessarily ask to be on their show. It wouldn't necessarily make sense. I interviewed, I don't know if you know Charles Duhigg. He wrote Super Communicators. He's a New York Times published author, best-selling author.
Nice.
So more high-profile people that are just super smart and are introducing a topic that is really valuable for my communication podcast.
And sorry, so is this mostly for your business English podcast?
So for a name like that, so I had him on All Ears English because
Okay.
he needed to be shared with the entire, he's a published author. He's really smart.
Yeah.
It's exciting to have someone that well-known on the show. And so I would put him on our main show, on our bigger show, but I would put more niche business professionals on Business English for sure. But most of our guests end up on All Ears English, our big guests.
Yeah, it makes sense. That's where you have it's like the highest bang for their buck and everything too. And I think like people who are listening and learning English, a conversation for me at least, the way that I learn is through through just listening. I feel like that is super valuable. And at the same time, like they're hearing a real life conversation in English about something deep and important. If they might not understand a few words, that's perfect because that's right on the edge of where the best kind of learning happens. I think it's great. I think it's an awesome idea. And also just one funny thing that you said about most people who listen to this are English first. It is true for sure, but because my fiance used to co-host the show with me, she would share it with her people in like Italy and Austria and all that. So I actually still have like a little pocket of Europeans who listen to every episode.
Well, welcome to
so
All
who
Ears
knows?
English.
yeah, totally. Okay, so we have covered a lot of stuff, but feed drops, guest appearances. So, and I think we've also like we've already pretty much covered like creating your own network. We've talked a lot about that. Essentially, I think like, if you have anything to add to this, but essentially what I'm picking up is like podcasting is built on relationships. You want people in your network who can come onto your show. You can go onto their show to feed swap, to ask for advice, all these things. And you just kind of search for people who you actually want to meet and then reach out to them in a unique way. Is there anything else you would add to that?
Yeah. I mean, I would think that as people get bigger, there's the option to join more of a formal large network or a smaller network, or, Podcast One. I work with the Podglomerate. They're different sizes and there are real benefits to that. I'm not officially in their network. I work with them in a way, but it is there. I can see the benefits of that because if they're coming to you and they're saying, hey, there's this other compatible show. Would you like to do a promo swap? Which we didn't quite talk about, but it's a similar idea just with a little promo.
Yeah.
They're bringing that to you. So that's just less time you have to spend going out and prospecting. There is something there. And usually that includes, ad fill and that sort of thing. But there are things you give up too. So that's another conversation to have as your listeners' shows start to grow.
Yeah, I love that. Promo swaps make perfect sense. Just a win-win again, just like the feed swap thing. So, okay, so we have talked about a few things that have, taken your show to the level that it is now. One thing that I said that I would ask later is what are like either one or two or however many you want to list, like what are some things that have not worked how you expected or just have been you thought it was going to be great and it just bombed, just something like that?
So I think the thread that brings together everything that doesn't work, as far as I can see, is anytime you ask someone to change to develop a new habit, that habit is listening to a podcast. So if my habit is to go into Instagram and read my feed and my chats and things in Instagram, I'm an Instagram user. That doesn't mean just because I like your content, I'm going to become a podcast listener. So in my mind, let the big names like Oprah or, whoever, Princess, just the royal family, let them deal with bringing over new listeners into podcasting, more mainstream famous people. And for us, staying within podcasting and making sure you can grab as many listeners as you can that are already in that environment is just so much easier.
Yeah. I think that's awesome though. Like to literally those people who have the big, like the massive reach, allow them to do the broad marketing and like the idea that there are a certain amount of the percentage of people who listen to podcasts at least in the West, that's the numbers that I know are growing. Like it's always growing constantly, but there's still a percentage of people who do not listen to podcasts. And so I think what's also been echoed by a handful of other people who have had big shows as well is that like go to where people already are, like get new listeners through the platform that you have the thing on, which is podcasting.
Exactly. Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, because those larger celebrities, they have the budget to go and bring in new listeners. They can do a TV commercial about their podcast, but I'm not about to do any TV commercial. Right? So
Yeah, of
like kind of
course.
knowing, and but you can certainly become as big as those podcasts. Like a lot of those shows are not necessarily huge shows. Some of them are, but some of them are actually smaller than you think. So you can grow as large as them. You just grow in a different way. Then I think anything where you can't, it's hard because measuring success in podcast growth, the tools are just not here in the way that you even have them on YouTube or even Facebook ads, how they used to be a few years ago. I can say that we do track our results for the feed drops in Chartable. We use Chartable, so we can know percentages there more or less. We tried once, we did a live event in Japan.
Oh, wow. That's cool.
Yeah, we had some listeners there and had a whole weekend adventure thing. And we actually made signs and stood in Shibuya Crossing. I don't know if you've ever been to Tokyo, Justin, but it's a
Not
crazy
yet.
place. So
Yeah,
much
that's
traffic.
amazing.
Some listeners actually came up to us. They're like, I know all there's English. And we're
No
like, oh, this
way.
is cool. Meeting our listeners. But the truth is, I don't really know how well that worked. I don't think it worked very well. Because again, you're asking people, they're walking. How do we know they're podcast listeners already? How do we know they know how to download a podcast? So I think sticking within the podcast environment is smart. There might be a time as you get bigger to build out other platforms. I would say that, we have a YouTube channel. It's not as successful as our podcast, but we publish to YouTube. We have an
Yeah.
Instagram channel. It's just that we don't rely on those channels to grow the podcast. We grow YouTube listeners on YouTube. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Yeah, this is great. And I think what I would love is there were like 3 or 4 more things that I would have loved to dive into. So later down the road, maybe even like sooner rather than later, I would love to just have you back to talk a bit more about literally just like diving into a bit more about Chartable, what you just talked about, and then also the business that you've built behind the podcast as well is super interesting. And most of our listeners are not podcasting just for fun. They're podcasting because they've got some type of business or some type of life that they want to live, and the podcast plays into that whole thing. They're not looking to be famous podcasters essentially. So I would love to bring you back on. And before we kind of wrap everything up, where do you want people to find you? Like, are we just sending them straight to the podcast or?
Yeah, I would say go to the podcast, check out the podcast. If you're learning English as a second language as a professional, or just as a hobby, as an adult, come on over, hit follow on the show. We do publish now, like I said, 5 days a week on All Ears English. So we'd love to have you as and that's the other thing we didn't talk about, Justin.
I know,
is
I was just saying. Yeah.
Huge. Not just huge for your listeners, but huge for just, Apple Podcasts and Spotify learning that you are reliable, you deliver, and it just creates a snowball effect. But that could be for the next interview or whatever. So so definitely come over, hit follow on the show. And then if people are interested in getting some, informal coaching on podcasting, you could reach out to me on my LinkedIn. You can search for my name and All Ears English. So Linsday McMahon, All Ears English, I will come up, reach out, and happy to offer any informal tips on that level until I start really helping people out. Not there yet, Justin. There's so many things to do in a day.
Oh, you're speaking to the right person. I totally get it. We're going to link all that below, and I'm going to shoot a few people your show because I think that it's going to really help them out as well. And yeah, thank you. You're going to be, I mean, as long as you want to, you're going to be back, I think. So we'll just say until next time, I guess.
Excellent. We'll see you next time then. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it. All
Yeah,
right.
see everybody. Hey, just before you go, I'm really happy that you made it to the end of this episode. It means the world to me. I only want to ask for one thing in return for putting together all this content for free, and that's just leaving a review if you can, wherever you're listening, if it's Apple or Spotify. Just leaving a quick review is super, super helpful for us. It's going to help more people find the show so I can keep putting this content together for free. Thank you so much, and we will see you on the next episode of Oh My Pod.